26 Crusader expeditions reshaped the medieval world. These massive campaigns were not just about holy war. They were engines of empire that forged kingdoms and redrawn borders across continents, only to have many of those realms vanish from our collective memory. By the end of this journey, you will understand how these forgotten conflicts created a new world order whose echoes we still feel today. How did a disorganized mob of peasants launch the First Crusade? And what secret diplomacy returned Jerusalem without a single battle? What does it truly take to build an empire that lasts? What story from history do you think deserves to be remembered? The stage was set not by a single king or emperor, but by a world cracking under immense pressure. In the East, the Byzantine Empire, once Rome's mighty successor, was struggling to hold its borders. A new power, the Seljuk Turks, was on the rise, their conquests shifting the balance of power across Anatolia and the Holy Land. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, a potent fusion of deep religious faith and restless knightly ambition was simmering. Land was scarce for younger sons, and the promise of both spiritual salvation and territorial gain created a powerful, volatile energy. Into this tinderbox stepped Pope Urban II. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, he issued a call that would echo for centuries. He urged Christian warriors to take up arms not merely as soldiers, but as penitents on a sacred journey to aid their Eastern brethren and reclaim Jerusalem. The response was electric. This was not a simple war. It was an armed pilgrimage offering a full remission of sins, a chance for glory, and an opportunity for land and legacy. This perfect storm of faith, politics, and raw economics explains why thousands suddenly left their homes for a dangerous, uncertain future. It is this foundation that makes the chaotic and world-altering events of the First Crusade not just understandable, but almost inevitable. The official crusade had not even begun when a tidal wave of fervor surged ahead of it. While kings and dukes were still gathering their armies, a charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit gathered a very different kind of force. This was the People's Crusade, a vast and disorganized multitude of peasants, poor knights, and fervent believers. They were not soldiers in polished armor. They were a movement on foot, driven by an unshakable belief that their faith alone would shield them. They marched east long before the planned military expeditions, their journey fueled by a powerful, almost apocalyptic enthusiasm. But what happens when pure conviction meets the harsh realities of a long campaign? Their faith was immense, but their planning was non-existent. They had little food, no supply lines, and no coherent strategy. As this desperate horde moved through foreign lands, their lack of discipline led to clashes and shortages, turning their pilgrimage into a scramble for survival long before they reached their goal. The first major confrontation with the disciplined Seljuk cavalry in Asia Minor was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The Seljuk forces easily surrounded and annihilated the exhausted and untrained Crusaders. This disastrous defeat was a brutal lesson. It demonstrated with terrible clarity that religious zeal, no matter how powerful, was no substitute for military organization, training, and command. Yet within this failure lay a crucial insight for the powers of Europe. The sheer scale of the popular response revealed a deep, grassroots energy that could be harnessed. The princes and generals who followed learned from this catastrophe. They saw the need for strict discipline, proper logistics, and unified command. The People's Crusade, for all its tragedy, proved the concept had a powerful popular heart, but it also wrote the first lesson in the Crusaders' manual: zeal must be tempered by steel. While the People's Crusade had dissolved into chaos, the main force was only just beginning its march. This was the Prince's Crusade, a stark contrast to the fervent mob that preceded it. Led by formidable European nobles like Godfrey of Bouillon, a duke from Lorraine, and the powerful and pious Raymond IV of Toulouse, this was a true military expedition. Their armies were not a disorganized crowd. They were professional soldiers, knights in chainmail, supported by engineers and supply trains. Their convergence on the Holy Land was a feat of medieval coordination, a slow, grinding advance across thousands of miles. This campaign was defined by brutal siege warfare, like the long and costly encirclement of the great city of Antioch. For months, the Crusaders endured starvation and desertion, trapped between the city walls and a massive relief force. Their eventual victory there was less a conventional military triumph and more a desperate gamble that paid off, a moment that solidified their belief in divine favor. That belief culminated in the final, grueling push to their ultimate goal. In July of 1099, after a month-long siege, the Crusader armies finally breached the walls of Jerusalem. What followed was a horrific slaughter of the city's inhabitants, a stark reminder that these holy wars were fought with a terrible, earthly brutality. Yet from that bloodshed emerged a new political reality. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was proclaimed, with Godfrey of Bouillon becoming its first ruler, not as a king but as the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Other Crusader states, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, were carved out along the coast. This was the tangible result of the Prince's Crusade. A coordinated military machine had achieved what pure passion could not. It forged the first of these forgotten empires, a fragile Christian foothold in the heart of the Levant that would define the conflict for the next 200 years. But how do you hold onto a kingdom you just conquered, surrounded by powerful and determined neighbors? The very success of the Crusade planted the seeds for the next great challenge, one that would test the survival of these new realms to their absolute limit. The new kingdom was a fragile beacon, and its survival depended on a steady stream of reinforcements from the west, but the journey to supply it had already become a deadly gauntlet. A fresh wave of crusaders, known to history as the Crusade of 1101, began its march. These were not latecomers, they were nobles and knights who had taken sacred vows to reach Jerusalem, but had been unable to join the first triumphant campaign. They were determined to fulfill their oaths and bolster the defenses of the nascent Crusader states. Their expedition was a direct response to the success of the Prince's Crusade, a mission to secure what had been won. Yet, this confident follow-up wave walked directly into a trap. The Seljuk Turks had learned from their previous defeats. They now understood the routes these European armies had to take through the rugged passes of Anatolia. Instead of meeting the Crusaders in open battle, the Seljuk forces mastered the art of the ambush. They harried the long, vulnerable columns of marching men, using the harsh terrain to their absolute advantage. The Crusaders, stretched thin and struggling with supply shortages, were systematically cut down. The campaign was not merely defeated, it was annihilated, a complete military disaster that never even reached the Holy Land. This catastrophic failure revealed a brutal new truth. The initial victory that had carved out the Crusader states was a singular event, a product of surprise and momentum that could not be easily repeated. The Crusade of 1101 proved that the land route from Europe was now a killing field, controlled by a strategically superior enemy who understood the landscape and how to exploit an army's weaknesses. That first glorious success had created a kingdom, but this second bloody failure exposed just how terrifyingly isolated that kingdom truly was. How could a realm so cut off from its homeland possibly endure? The answer would not come from another massive army, but from a new kind of warrior institution, one that would become both the shield of the kingdom and a power in its own right. From the frozen fjords of Scandinavia, a new kind of crusader set sail. King Sigurd I of Norway, a Viking lord baptized for a new age, launched a fleet of 60 longships on an epic voyage. This was not a march across land, but a sea king's pilgrimage, a journey that would take his Norse warriors from their northern homes all the way to the holy city of Jerusalem. Their expedition, beginning in 1107, was a unique fusion of old and new, where Viking traditions of navigation and raiding met the fervent ideals of the crusading movement. They did not take the dangerous land route through Anatolia. Instead, they sailed down the coasts of Europe, turning the sea itself into their highway to the Holy Land. Along the way, the line between pilgrim and pirate blurred. In Iberia and the Balearic Islands, they raided both Muslim and Christian settlements, gathering treasure and supplies, their actions a stark reminder that the crusading spirit was often interwoven with the pragmatic pursuit of wealth and glory. When Sigurd's fleet finally arrived in the Levant, they were not seen as marauders but as saviors. King Baldwin I of Jerusalem eagerly welcomed these hardened Norse warriors and their formidable fleet. In a perfect marriage of Norwegian sea power and Frankish land forces, they laid siege to the vital port city of Sidon. With the Norwegian longships blockading the city from the sea and the Jerusalemite army assaulting its land walls, Sidon fell in 1110. This victory was a crucial strategic gain, securing another key link in the coastal defense of the fragile kingdom. The Norwegian Crusade demonstrated the incredible geographic reach of the crusading idea, drawing warriors from the very edge of the known world to fight for a cause thousands of miles from their home. It proved that the defense of the Latin East was not just a French or Italian endeavor, but a project that could unite the most diverse corners of Christendom. But as one king from the north brought his strength to shore up the kingdom, a new storm was gathering in the east, one that would demand a very different kind of defense. Venice was a city built on water, and now its gaze turned toward the riches of the east. When the call for help came from a beleaguered kingdom of Jerusalem, the Venetian Republic saw not just a holy cause, but a golden opportunity. Under the command of their shrewd leader, Doge Domenico Michiel, a massive Venetian fleet set sail in 1122. This was not a land army of pious knights. It was a naval expedition from a mercantile superpower, and its motives were a potent blend of faith and commerce. The kingdom was struggling, its coastal cities threatened and its supply lines precarious. The Venetians answered the call for aid, but they came with a price. Their target was the formidable port city of Tyre, a coastal fortress so well defended it was considered nearly impregnable. The siege that followed was a masterclass in persistence and naval power. For months, the Venetian fleet blockaded the city from the sea, while the army of Jerusalem assaulted its massive land walls. The defenders held out, hoping for a relief force that never came. The stalemate was finally broken not by a dramatic assault, but by a clever ruse. The Venetians secretly began building a mighty siege tower on their ships, a floating fortress they planned to push against the city's seaward defenses. When the defenders saw this monstrous engine of war under construction, their will broke. Faced with an attack from the one direction they thought safe, they surrendered. The fall of Tyre in 1124 was a monumental victory. It gave the Kingdom of Jerusalem its most important Mediterranean port, a vital lifeline for trade and reinforcements from Europe. But the real prize went to Venice. In return for their indispensable help, the Venetians were granted something far more valuable than temporary glory. They received extensive trading privileges across the kingdom, including their own exclusive quarters in major ports, freedom from taxes, and their own courts to settle disputes. They were no longer just allies, they were stakeholders with a permanent, privileged foothold. This expedition redefined the very nature of crusading. It proved that the survival of the Crusader states now depended as much on the ledgers of Italian merchants as it did on the swords of Frankish knights. The Venetian Crusade forged an economic empire within the Holy War, creating commercial networks that would enrich the serene Republic for centuries to come. But this new reliance on sea power created a new vulnerability. What happens when the very cities that supply the kingdom decide its survival is no longer profitable? A king's crusade should have been a turning point for the better. Louis VII of France, a monarch of deep and somber piety, took the cross with his queen, Helena of Aquitaine, a woman whose wealth and cultural influence rivaled his own. Their joint expedition in 1147 was the Second Crusade, a massive undertaking preached into existence by the most powerful religious voice in Europe, Bernard of Clairvaux. It was meant to be a glorious reinforcement, a demonstration of Europe's unwavering commitment to the holy cause. The French and German armies that marched east were among the most formidable ever assembled. Yet this grand alliance was doomed from the start. The German contingent under Emperor Conrad III rushed ahead, only to be shattered by Seljuk forces in Anatolia, their broken remnants stumbling back to meet the French. This lack of coordination was a fatal flaw, a crack in the very foundation of their strength. When the combined and now weakened Crusader forces finally reached the Holy Land, they made a momentous and perplexing decision. They would not secure vulnerable borders or reclaim lost towns. Instead, they aimed for the ultimate prize, the rich and powerful city of Damascus. It was a bold move, but also a deeply strategic blunder. Damascus was a former ally of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a buffer state that had often balanced against more powerful Muslim rivals. By attacking it, the Crusaders shattered a crucial diplomatic arrangement and united their enemies against them. The siege itself was a masterpiece of mismanagement. After just 4 days of positioning themselves in a well-watered orchard with a clear path to the city walls, the Crusader leaders were persuaded, perhaps by local barons with their own agendas, to abandon their strong position. They moved to a barren, waterless plain on the opposite side of the city, where the walls were far stronger. It was a suicidal maneuver. Trapped without supplies and harassed by relentless attacks, the proud crusading army was forced into a humiliating, disorderly retreat. The collapse of the Second Crusade sent shockwaves from Jerusalem to Rome. A campaign led by 2 emperors and blessed by the Church had ended in abject, pointless failure. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Crusader since the First Crusade evaporated overnight. More dangerously, it revealed a deep and growing cancer within the crusading movement, a fatal disunity where personal ambition and local politics repeatedly trumped the common good. If the combined might of France and Germany could not secure a victory, what hope was left for the isolated kingdoms of the East? This crushing defeat did not just lose a battle, it broke the very idea of the Crusade as an unstoppable force of divine will. While the Crusader kingdoms reeled from the failure at Damascus, a different kind of holy war was unfolding far to the north. The same papal call that launched Louis VII and Conrad III toward Jerusalem also authorized a crusade against the pagan Wends along the stormy Baltic coast. This was the Wendish Crusade of 1147, a campaign that reveals a starkly different face of the crusading movement. Here, the enemy was not a powerful Seljuk sultanate, but a confederation of Slavic tribes who had long resisted the encroachment of their Christian neighbors. The army was not a multinational force of French and Germans, but a coalition of Saxon nobles led by powerful figures like Henry the Lion. Their goal was not to reclaim a holy city, but to expand their own domains and forcibly convert the local population. This was the crusading ideal adapted for a local context where faith and territorial ambition became inseparable. The campaign itself was a brutal affair of raids and sieges, culminating in an attack on the Wendish fortress of Dobbin. The Saxons achieved a nominal victory, forcing some Wendish rulers to accept baptism to avoid annihilation. But these conversions were superficial, a political necessity rather than a genuine change of heart. As soon as the crusading army departed, many of the new converts simply returned to their old beliefs. The Wendish Crusade failed to achieve any lasting territorial conquest or deep religious conversion. Its true success was in establishing a precedent. It demonstrated that the spiritual rewards of a crusade could be applied to wars of expansion on Europe's own frontier, effectively sanctifying the long, slow drift of German power eastward. This northern front was a parallel story to the drama in the Holy Land, a reminder that the energy of the Crusades was not a single beam of light focused on Jerusalem, but a prism that refracted into many different colors across the medieval world. And as one frontier saw its first sanctioned crusade, another would soon face a storm that threatened to erase the Crusader kingdoms from the map completely. As the Second Crusade crumbled into dust outside Damascus, a different kind of victory was taking shape on the opposite shore of the Mediterranean. A fleet of English, German, and Flemish crusaders, also bound for the Holy Land, found their journey interrupted by a fierce storm. Forced to seek shelter on the coast of Portugal, they encountered a local king with an ambitious proposal. Afonso I, ruler of a young and expanding Portugal, saw in these seasoned warriors a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. He convinced them to redirect their holy vows for a time toward a target much closer at hand, the wealthy Moorish city of Lisbon. What began as an unexpected detour became one of the most consequential sieges of the entire crusading era. For 17 grueling weeks, the international Crusader force and the Portuguese army worked together, blockading the city by sea and assaulting its formidable walls by land. The defenders of Lisbon put up a desperate fight, but the combination of northern siege engineering and local persistence proved overwhelming. When the city finally fell in October of 1147, its capture sent a shockwave through the Iberian Peninsula. This was not just another battle in the long Reconquista, it was a transformative event. The capture of Lisbon delivered the future capital of Portugal into Christian hands, securing the central coast and dramatically expanding the territory of the nascent kingdom. It provided a massive infusion of land, wealth, and strategic confidence. This expedition perfectly illustrates the sprawling, adaptable nature of the crusading movement. While the grand armies of kings failed spectacularly in the east, a pragmatic alliance on the Atlantic coast forged a kingdom that would endure for centuries. The same spiritual energy that carved out ephemeral states in the Levant was simultaneously building a permanent empire in the West, proving that the true impact of the Crusades was not one story, but many. The fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187 was a tremor that shook Europe to its core. The dream of a Christian Holy Land, an achievement that had stood for nearly 90 years, was suddenly shattered. In response, the three greatest monarchs of the age took the cross. Frederick Barbarossa, the grizzled Holy Roman Emperor, led a massive German army overland. Philip Augustus, the shrewd and calculating King of France, and Richard the Lionheart, the charismatic and formidable warrior King of England, prepared to march by sea. This was the Third Crusade, a titanic effort to reclaim the spiritual heart of the Crusader world. yet the Grand Alliance was fractured from the start. Frederick Barbarossa, after a long and successful march through Anatolia, met a bizarre and fatal end, drowning in a river before ever reaching the Holy Land. His death scattered his leaderless army, and with it vanished the hope of a unified, three-pronged assault. What remained was a tense and deeply competitive partnership between Richard and Philip. Their first great test was the Siege of Acre, a vital port city held by Saladin's forces. For 2 grueling years, the Crusaders maintained the blockade, fighting off relief armies and enduring disease and starvation in their own camps. The city's eventual surrender was the Crusades' first major victory, but it also exposed the deep rift between the two kings. Philip, his health failing and his political concerns in France mounting, soon abandoned the campaign, leaving Richard as the sole architect of the war. What followed was a masterclass in military maneuvering. Richard knew he had to secure the coast to provide a lifeline for the beleaguered Crusader kingdom. His disciplined march south from Acre, with the sea protecting one flank and his infantry forming a mobile fortress against Saladin's cavalry, was a tactical triumph. At the Battle of Arsuf, Saladin's forces launched wave after wave of attacks, hoping to break the Crusader column. Richard held his nerve, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash his armored knights in a single, devastating countercharge that shattered the Muslim line. This victory secured the coastal road, but the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, remained elusive. Richard marched to its very walls not once, but twice. He stood close enough to see the city's towers, yet he made the agonizing decision not to lay siege. He knew that even if he captured the city, he lacked the permanent garrison needed to hold it once his army returned home. The crusade ended not with a bang, but with a treaty. The Treaty of Ramla in 1192 left Jerusalem under Muslim control but guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the holy sites. More importantly, it preserved a narrow but crucial strip of coastal territory, a rump kingdom centered around Acre. The Third Crusade had failed in its grand ambition, but it had succeeded in its most vital task. It had saved the Crusader project from total annihilation. It redefined the borders of Outremer, creating a new kind of entity, a maritime state utterly dependent on sea power and constant reinforcement from the west. The legend of Richard the Lionheart was forged in this campaign, a story of brilliant generalship and ultimate pragmatism that secured a precarious new status quo for 100 more years. Even a successful crusade could be undone by a single piece of news from home. In the wake of Richard the Lionheart's departure, a new German army arrived in the Holy Land in 1197, determined to finish the work of their legendary emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, whose own crusade had ended so tragically in a river. This German crusade was a formidable force, well-funded and disciplined, and it immediately proved its worth. They swiftly captured the vital port city of Beirut, a victory that had immense strategic importance. For the first time in years, they re-established a land bridge, reconnecting the Kingdom of Jerusalem in the south with the northern Crusader states like Tripoli and Antioch. The coastal road was secure, and the fragmented Crusader territories were whole again. It was a moment of genuine hope, a chance to rebuild a cohesive and defensible realm. But just as this new momentum was building, a messenger arrived from across the sea with devastating news. Back in Germany, the emperor had died. This was not a reference to the long-dead Frederick, but to his son and successor. For the German princes and knights leading the army, this changed everything. Their vows to God were instantly overshadowed by their ambitions and fears for their own lands and titles back in Europe. In a heartbeat, the entire purpose of the campaign collapsed. the leaders abandoned their soldiers, their conquests, and their allies, rushing back to Germany to secure their political positions in the inevitable struggle for the imperial throne. The army, left leaderless and without direction, simply dissolved. Beirut was held, but the grand opportunity to fortify the entire coast and push inland vanished. This expedition is perhaps the purest example of a recurring tragedy, where the fate of empires in the East was decided not on the battlefields of the Levant, but in the throne rooms of Europe. It demonstrated that no matter how well equipped an army was, or how brilliant its victories, it could all be rendered meaningless by the distant scramble for power. If the survival of the Crusader states hinged on such fickle loyalties, what hope was there for a lasting peace? The answer would soon come from a completely different direction, not from kings and emperors, but from the heart of the Church itself, launching a crusade that would redefine the very meaning of holy war. Even the most sacred vows could be bent by the hard arithmetic of debt. The Fourth Crusade began with the familiar goal of reclaiming Jerusalem, but it was immediately entangled in a web of Venetian finance. The Crusaders had contracted with the Republic of Venice for a vast fleet to carry them to Egypt, the new strategic heart of Muslim power. But when they assembled in Venice, they discovered a devastating shortfall. They could not pay the 85,000 silver marks they owed. The expedition was stranded, its holy purpose held hostage by a balance sheet. In that moment of crisis, the Doge of Venice, Enrico Dandolo, a blind and ancient man of immense cunning, offered them a way out. He would postpone their debt if they would first perform a service for the Republic, assisting the Venetian fleet in recapturing the rebellious Christian city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast. The Crusaders, trapped between their vows and their creditors, made a fateful choice. They turned their weapons against a Catholic city, an act that earned them immediate excommunication from the Pope. The sacred war had been subverted by its own logistics, its army becoming a mercenary force to pay its bills, and this was only the beginning of the diversion. A new opportunity for further payment soon arrived in the form of a young Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, who promised the Crusaders immense wealth, soldiers for their cause, and the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches if they would only help him reclaim the throne of Constantinople from his usurping uncle. The temptation was irresistible. The crusade, now fully derailed, set sail not for the Holy Land, but for the greatest Christian city in the world. The army that camped outside the monumental walls of Constantinople in 1203 was not there as an ally for long. When their candidate, the young Alexios, was installed as co-emperor, he found the imperial treasury empty and could not deliver the extravagant payments he had promised. Resentment festered between the Western Knights and the city's Greek populace. What began as a political intervention spiraled into a full-scale assault. In April of 1204, the Crusaders breached the walls and unleashed a three-day storm of plunder and destruction upon the ancient capital of the Roman world. They smashed holy icons, melted ancient statues for their bronze, and hauled away relics and treasures on an unimaginable scale. The great libraries were burned, and the magnificent altar of the Hagia Sophia was hacked to pieces so the Crusaders could divide the silver among themselves. This was not a conquest, it was a cataclysm. In place of the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders and their Venetian patrons carved up the spoils, establishing the Latin Empire of Constantinople and a patchwork of feudal states across Greece. The Venetians claimed the strategic ports and islands that would form the backbone of their maritime empire. This expedition forged a forgotten empire, but at a catastrophic cost. It shattered the primary Christian power in the East, creating a deep and lasting schism between the Orthodox and Catholic churches that would never truly heal. By fatally weakening the Byzantine bulwark, the Fourth Crusade did more damage to Christendom's eastern defenses than any Muslim army ever had. The Crusaders had set out to recover Jerusalem, but in their pursuit of payment, they had destroyed the very civilization that had once been the first line of defense for the Holy Land. How could any kingdom in the East hope to survive after such a self-inflicted wound? A holy war was now being waged within the very heart of Christendom. While Crusader armies had long marched east to fight foreign faiths, the 12th Great Expedition turned its fury inward upon a Christian population in the south of France. This was the Albigensian Crusade, a 20-year campaign of fire and blood that began in 1209, and it would redefine the very map of France. The target was not a Muslim sultanate, but a group known as the Cathars, who held beliefs the Church in Rome deemed dangerously heretical. The Pope issued a call to arms, offering the same spiritual rewards for fighting this internal enemy as for a journey to Jerusalem. But beneath the surface of religious fervor ran a powerful current of political ambition. The Languedoc region was a land apart, a vibrant tapestry of Occitan culture where troubadours sang of courtly love and local nobles like the Count of Toulouse held power independent of the French crown in the north. The Crusade became the perfect instrument for King Philip Augustus of France to extend his authority. Northern French barons, eager for land and salvation, descended upon the south. The conflict's brutal character was cemented at the city of Béziers. When a Crusader commander was asked how to tell a heretic from a faithful Catholic, he gave a chilling order: kill them all, for God will know his own. The city was put to the sword, its population massacred without distinction. This was not a war for a city, but for the soul of a region. The Crusade ground on for 2 decades, a relentless series of sieges and burnings that systematically broke the power of the southern nobility and crushed the Cathar faith. The vibrant, independent Occitan culture was extinguished, its language and traditions suppressed. By 1229, the Languedoc was no longer a land of its own. It was forcibly integrated into the domain of the French king, its internal borders erased. The Albigensian Crusade forged a more unified and powerful kingdom of France, proving that the engine of holy war could be aimed inward, reshaping a kingdom not by conquering new frontiers, but by brutally consolidating its own. A child's faith can topple empires, or so they believed. In the year 1212, as kings and popes planned their next great campaign, a very different kind of crusade began to stir. It did not spring from royal courts, but from the fields and villages of France and Germany. A young boy, some said a shepherd named Stephen from Cloyes, began preaching that he had received a divine vision. He claimed that ordinary children with hearts pure and unburdened by sin could succeed where armored knights had failed. Their weapon would not be the sword, but simple faith. Their innocence, he promised, would part the Mediterranean Sea like Moses, allowing them to walk dry-shod to Jerusalem and reclaim it for Christ through prayer and song. The idea was as electrifying as it was absurd. Thousands of children and teenagers, along with the poor and the pious, abandoned their homes to follow him and other youthful prophets. They carried no supplies, no maps, and no weapons, only an unshakable conviction that God would provide. This was the Children's Crusade, a movement built on a heartbreaking mirage of divine intervention. The harsh world, however, had no patience for miracles. The sea did not part for them. In France, many followers were simply told by King Philip Augustus to go home, their fervor dismissed as a nuisance. The German contingent, led by a boy named Nicopolis, met a far darker fate. Marching south through the Alps, many perished from hunger and exposure. Those who reached the coast of Italy found not a pathway to glory, but merchants and slavers waiting for them. Promised ships to the Holy Land, they were instead betrayed. Several shiploads of these young crusaders were sailed not to Jerusalem, but to the slave markets of North Africa, where they were sold into a life of bondage. Whether this event was one single coordinated movement or a series of disconnected popular fervors, later woven into legend, matters less than its powerful symbolism. The Children's Crusade stands as the crusading ideal stripped bare of all politics and military power, reduced to its most raw and vulnerable form, pure, desperate faith. It reveals the profound depth of the yearning that the crusade could inspire, a yearning so powerful it could convince children to walk across a continent toward an imaginary sea. This tragic episode forces us to ask, what does it say about a world where the most innocent bear the cruelest cost for its grandest ambitions? The failure of the Children's Crusade cast a long shadow over the entire enterprise, revealing a desperate need for a return to cold, hard strategy. That strategy, when it finally came, was brutally logical. The Fifth Crusade, beginning in 1217, represented a fundamental shift in thinking. The Crusaders now understood that Jerusalem was merely a symbol, its fate controlled by the real power to the south. The Ayyubid Sultanate in Egypt was the engine room, supplying the armies and the wealth that held the holy city. To secure Jerusalem, they would have to conquer Cairo. This was a campaign aimed directly at the heart of the enemy, a recognition that you win a war not by capturing a trophy, but by dismantling your opponent's ability to fight. An international army of Hungarians, Austrians, and Frisians converged on the Nile Delta, their target the vital port city of Damietta. Guarding a key branch of the river, Damietta was the gateway to Egypt, and its capture would choke the Sultanate's Mediterranean trade and open a water highway straight to its capital. The siege was a monumental test of endurance, lasting nearly a year and a half. The Crusaders built a formidable fortified camp, fighting off disease, starvation, and relentless attacks from the Ayyubid forces. They even constructed a massive floating fortress on the river to break the city's defensive chain. Their persistence paid off. In 1219, weakened and isolated, Damietta finally fell. It was the greatest victory since the Third Crusade, a triumph of focused military planning that put the entire Nile Valley within their grasp. But then, as so often happened, the victory was squandered. Instead of consolidating their hold and using Damietta as a permanent base, the Crusader leadership, swayed by internal divisions and overconfidence, decided to gamble everything. They abandoned their secure position and marched south, deep into the labyrinth of the Nile Delta, aiming for Cairo itself. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The annual Nile flood turned the flatlands into a vast lake, trapping the Crusader army on a narrow strip of land. With their supplies cut off and the Egyptian fleet controlling the river behind them, they were completely encircled. There would be no glorious battle, only a slow, humiliating stranglehold. Forced to choose between annihilation and surrender, the Crusaders chose surrender. The terms were total. They gave up everything, including the hard-won city of Damietta, in exchange for their safe retreat. The Fifth Crusade proved that the Crusaders could learn. They had identified the correct strategic center of gravity and executed a brilliant plan to seize it. Yet they remained trapped in an older, more fatal pattern, where a single moment of overreach could erase years of careful effort and sacrifice. They had mastered the art of the first strike, but they consistently failed the test of the long game. If even a perfectly targeted campaign could unravel so completely, what new approach could possibly break this cycle of triumph and catastrophe? An excommunicated emperor now held the fate of Jerusalem in his hands. Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire was a man of profound contradictions, a Christian monarch fluent in Arabic, a skeptic who led a crusade while officially cast out of the church. His expedition, the Sixth Crusade, launched in 1228, was unlike any that had come before. It arrived not with the thunder of charging knights, but with the quiet intensity of diplomatic negotiation. Frederick did not see the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, as merely an infidel to be crushed. He saw him as a political player, a man with his own problems, including a rival claimant to his throne. Frederick leveraged this knowledge, engaging in a series of sophisticated talks that recognized a mutual interest. War was expensive and risky for both sides, but a temporary peace could offer stability. The resulting Treaty of Jaffa in 1229 was a diplomatic marvel. Without a single major battle, Frederick secured the peaceful return of Jerusalem, along with the holy cities of Nazareth and Bethlehem, to Christian control for a period of 10 years. The city that had cost rivers of blood to capture and had been lost in a single disastrous battle was now regained through words. To cement his incredible achievement, Frederick marched into Jerusalem and, in an act of supreme political theater, crowned himself King of Jerusalem in the very church of the Holy Sepulchre. The Pope's own excommunicate, barred from the sacraments, had become the guardian of Christendom's holiest site. This crusade forged a forgotten empire of paper and promises, a realm defined not by fortified borders, but by the clauses of a truce. It stood as brilliant, fleeting proof that the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword, achieving through savvy statecraft what decades of grim warfare had failed to accomplish. But a peace built on a 10-year clock was always living on borrowed time. What would happen when the timer finally ran out and the swords were drawn once more? Frederick II's diplomatic triumph came with an expiration date. When his 10-year truce finally lapsed, the kingdom he had preserved with words was left terrifyingly exposed. Into this power vacuum rode a new generation of French and English nobles, a crusade not of kings but of powerful feudal lords. This was the Barons Crusade, a decentralized campaign that reflected the new reality of the Holy Land. There was no single commanding emperor or grand strategy, just a collection of ambitious knights like Theobald of Champagne and Richard of Cornwall, each leading their own contingent with their own goals. Their strength lay not in unity, but in their sheer persistence and their willingness to engage in the complex chessboard of Levantine politics. They did not simply march out to fight a monolithic Muslim enemy. Instead, they played rival sultans in Damascus and Cairo against each other, cutting deals and forming temporary alliances that served their immediate needs. In one remarkable instance, Theobald's forces actually allied with the Sultan of Damascus to wage a brief, joint war against his Egyptian rivals. This was not the clear-cut holy war of the past. It was a pragmatic struggle for survival where today's enemy could be tomorrow's partner. Through this web of shifting allegiances and sharp battlefield victories, the barons achieved what larger, more famous crusades had failed to do. They expanded the Crusader territories, securing key fortresses, and for a fleeting moment, even negotiating the return of Jerusalem itself to Christian control. The Barons' Crusade forged a forgotten empire of temporary truces and opportunistic pacts. Its legacy was not a stable kingdom with fixed borders, but a precarious network of influence held together by the shrewd, self-interested diplomacy of a few determined men. It proved that the Crusader states could endure, not through divine favor or overwhelming force, but by mastering the art of the local political game. But how long can a kingdom last when its foundations are built on such shifting sands? And what happens when a new power emerges that refuses to play by the old rules? A king's ransom could not buy back the dream of conquest. Louis IX of France, a monarch so devout he would later be declared a saint, led what history would remember as the last great crusade aimed at the heart of the Muslim world. His target, like the ill-fated Fifth Crusade before him, was Egypt. In 1248, his formidable army landed at the mouth of the Nile and achieved a stunning, almost immediate victory, seizing the heavily fortified port of Damietta. It seemed like a perfect beginning, a divine affirmation of their sacred cause. But this initial success was a mirage. Marching inland toward Cairo, the Crusaders were drawn into a brutal confrontation at the city of Al-Mansura. There, the French knights fought with legendary bravery, but they were outmaneuvered and trapped. The real enemy, however, was not the Egyptian army alone. Disease, the ancient scourge of every camp, swept through the Crusader ranks. Dysentery and typhoid decimated the soldiers, leaving them weak, dehydrated, and unable to fight. Trapped and dying, the mighty force was cut to pieces. In a humiliation that echoed across Christendom, King Louis himself was taken prisoner. The saintly king had to be purchased back with an enormous ransom, a fortune in gold that drained the treasury of France. Yet Louis' story did not end with his release. Instead of returning home in disgrace, he made a remarkable decision. He sailed north to the remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and remained there for 4 years. With his own funds and his royal authority, he embarked on a massive building project. He did not launch new campaigns. He focused on strengthening what was left, reinforcing the walls of Acre, Caesarea, and Jaffa with new towers and stronger fortifications. This was no longer a crusade of expansion. It was a mission of preservation. Louis IX had arrived as a conqueror, but he stayed as a custodian, shoring up the crumbling frontiers of a realm that was slowly, inexorably fading from the map. His expedition marked a profound shift. The moment the grand ambition to reclaim an empire gave way to the desperate, noble work of simply trying to save what little remained. A king's humiliation could shatter the faith of an entire kingdom, while Louis IX remained in the Holy Land, pouring his fortune into shoring up the last coastal strongholds. A very different kind of crusade erupted back in France. It began not in a royal court, but in the fields and villages of the north. In 1251, a man known only as the Master of Hungary began to preach a fiery new gospel. He claimed to have a letter sent directly from the Virgin Mary, a divine command that called not for noble knights, but for the poor and the pure, the shepherds and laborers, to achieve what kings had failed to do. This was the Shepherds Crusade, a movement built on a foundation of rage and despair. Its followers, thousands of peasants and lower clergy, believed a simple, explosive idea. The glorious crusade of their saintly king had not failed because of Muslim strength, but because of the moral rot festering within their own society. The noble lords and the wealthy bishops, they argued, were too corrupt, too greedy, and too sinful to ever win God's favor. Their holy war was a fraud, and the true soldiers of Christ were the common people they had always looked down upon. This spiritual fury quickly curdled into violence. The roaming bands of shepherds turned their wrath inward, first against the symbols of the establishment that had betrayed them. They stormed into monasteries and churches, assaulting priests and monks they accused of corruption. Then, as this mob mentality took hold, they found another, even more vulnerable target: the Jewish communities of France. They blamed the Jews for the economic hardships and for their perceived collaboration with the corrupt powers, launching brutal pogroms in towns like Bourges and Orléans. The authorities, who had initially tolerated this outburst of popular piety, now saw it for what it had become: a direct threat to the social order. Queen Blanche of Castile, ruling as regent while her son Louis was captive, had no choice. She gave the order to crush them. Royal knights hunted down the shepherds' armies, scattering and slaughtering them in the fields they had come from. The Shepherds' Crusade was more than a footnote. It was a screaming indictment of the entire crusading project. It proved that after 2 centuries of promises and failures, the ideal of holy war had broken in the hands of the people. The energy that once launched thousands toward Jerusalem was now twisting back on itself, a fire of disillusionment that burned down the very pillars of the society that had created it. If even a saintly king led only to ruin and the pure of heart were cut down by their own rulers, where could this fractured faith possibly go next? The answer would come from the East, not with a plea for help, but with a final, unstoppable demand for surrender. Louis IX's final crusade was a ghost of his first, haunted by the same ambition but drained of all its hope. Years after his return from the Holy Land, the aging Saint King felt the pull of his sacred vow once more. He would not return to the Egyptian graveyard that had broken his army and taken his freedom. Instead, he set his sights on a new, perplexing target, the North African city of Tunis. His plan was a strange and desperate gambit. He believed he could convert the ruler of Tunis to Christianity, transforming the city into a new forward base for a future, more successful assault on Egypt. It was a vision built on pure faith, completely detached from the political and military realities of the region. In 1270, his fleet landed on the coast near Tunis and laid siege to the city. But there would be no glorious battle, no dramatic charge. The crusade simply stalled, withering in the oppressive summer heat. The real enemy, as it had been in Egypt, was invisible. Dysentery and typhoid fever swept through the Crusader camp with a terrifying speed. The king who had survived capture and ransom was not felled by a sword, but by disease. Louis IX died there, in a dusty tent outside a city he never breached, his last words whispered in prayer. His death broke the army's spirit. The campaign collapsed into a negotiated withdrawal, a hollow agreement that secured little more than safe passage for the survivors to return home. It was a tragic and utterly pointless waste of life, a final crusade that achieved none of its spiritual or strategic goals. The death of the Saint King on that distant shore marked more than a personal tragedy. It was the end of an era. No major European monarch would ever again personally lead a great army to the east. The crusading project, once the grandest endeavor of Christendom, had lost its royal heart. With a dream of kings now extinguished, who was left to answer the call as the final shadows fell upon the last Crusader strongholds? A king's crusade could arrive too late to save a kingdom. In 1271, the future King Edward I of England landed at Acre, a prince leading a small but fiercely disciplined army. Edward was a soldier, a towering figure of martial energy, and he brought with him a reputation forged in the civil wars of England. He did not come with the vast, unwieldy host of a Louis IX, but with a compact and lethal force designed for swift, decisive action. His presence alone was a statement, a final assertion of European commitment to the crumbling frontiers of Outremer. He understood that he could not reclaim the Holy City or smash the Mamluk armies in a single grand battle. Instead, he launched a series of sharp, punishing raids from his base in Acre, striking at Mamluk supply lines and demonstrating that the Crusaders could still bite. Edward's real strength, however, lay not in his sword arm but in his political acumen. He recognized the overwhelming power of the Mamluk Sultan, Baybars, and he opened negotiations. The resulting 10-year truce was a masterpiece of pragmatic statecraft, a breathing spell for the desperate Crusader states that guaranteed their survival for another decade. It was the best possible outcome in a hopeless situation, but even this diplomatic victory was almost stolen away. Edward survived a dramatic assassination attempt, fending off a blade wielded by a supposed convert with his own bare hands. The incident left him wounded, a physical reminder of the relentless pressure facing the last outposts of the cross. When news arrived of his father's death and his own succession to the English throne, Edward had no choice but to depart. He left behind the truce he had brokered, a temporary shield for a realm that was already dying. Edward's crusade was the last meaningful military intervention from the West, the final time a major European power would send its heir to fight for the dream of Outremer. It was not a failure of will or skill, but a simple admission of a terrible new reality. The empires were already ghosts, and no truce, no matter how shrewd, could grant them a second life. The truce Edward I had brokered was a fragile shield, and its time was running out. In the spring of 1291, the last great Crusader city stood alone. Acre, the vibrant, chaotic capital of a kingdom that had shrunk to a single metropolis, was now the final target. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Kolul marched north with an army of overwhelming force, a tide of professional soldiers and massive siege engines determined to wipe the last stain of the Crusader presence from the coast. The siege began with a thunderous bombardment, a relentless hail of stone that shook the city's famed double walls. For weeks, the defenders, a desperate mix of knights, mercenaries, and citizens, fought from the ramparts, repelling wave after wave of assaults. But the numbers were simply too great. The Mamluks mined the towers, and one by one, the massive fortifications crumbled into dust. The final breach came in a storm of blood and steel. Mamluk soldiers poured into the streets, and the battle dissolved into a house-by-house slaughter. The last defenders made a final, hopeless stand at the Templar fortress by the sea, but it was a tomb. Those who were not cut down on the spot were dragged away into slavery. The fall of Acre was not just the loss of a city, it was the snapping of a 200-year thread. The other remaining strongholds, Tyre and Sidon, Beirut and Haifa, seeing their capital extinguished, simply emptied out. Their garrisons and populations fled by ship, abandoning them to the advancing Mamluk armies without a fight. In a matter of months, the entire coastline that had been known as Outremer was silent, its castles empty and its ports reclaimed. The Crusader Empire on the mainland, a political entity forged by the First Crusade and sustained through 2 centuries of war and diplomacy, was simply erased from the map. The fall of Acre redrew the borders of the Levant, closing a chapter that had begun with such world-altering ambition and ended in fire and silence. But if the land was lost, did the idea of the Crusade die with it, or had it already found new, stranger frontiers far from the Holy City? Even the final silence at Acre could not extinguish the crusading flame. The idea simply migrated, finding new purpose far from the dusty hills of Palestine. 2 generations after the last Christian banner fell on the mainland, a powerful new coalition assembled not for conquest but for containment. Venice, the ever-pragmatic merchant republic, joined forces with the battle-hardened Knights Hospitaller and the Kingdom of Cyprus. Their target was not a holy city but a strategic port on the Anatolian coast, the city of Smyrna. In 1344, their combined fleet descended upon this Turkish stronghold in a swift and brutal assault. This was not a grand army marching under a cross, it was a precise naval operation. Their victory at Smyrna was swift and strategically brilliant. They captured the port and its formidable fortress, tearing a vital anchorage from Turkish control. Why would a crusade be launched for a single city? Smyrna was a nest of Turkish pirates whose raids were strangling the lucrative trade lanes of the Aegean Sea. By seizing it, this Christian league accomplished 2 critical goals. They secured a permanent foothold on the Asian mainland, a dagger pointed at the heart of the emerging Turkish beyliks, and they made the sea lanes safe for the merchant galleys that were the lifeblood of Venice and Genoa. The Crusade of Smyrna redefined the entire concept of holy war. This was not about reclaiming a spiritual homeland. It was a calculated military and economic action designed to check the rising power of the Ottomans and protect commercial interests. The cross and the coin were now inseparable. This expedition proved that the crusade was no longer a pilgrimage. It had evolved into a permanent state of conflict, a cold war fought with galleys and garrisons to defend the borders of a commercial empire. But how do you contain an enemy that is not just raiding your coasts, but steadily building a land empire of its own? The path of crusading ambition now veered sharply from the Holy Land to the very gates of Europe. By the end of the 14th century, a new and terrifying power was rising in the east, the Ottoman Empire. Its armies were not merely raiding, they were systematically conquering the Balkans, pushing deeper into Christian territory with every passing year. The old crusading spirit, which had so often fixated on Jerusalem, was now summoned for a new and desperate purpose: to form a bulwark against this existential threat. The response was the Nicopolis Crusade of 1396, a grand coalition that was meant to be the answer to decades of Ottoman advance. It was led by the King of Hungary, Sigismund, and bolstered by the flower of French and Burgundian chivalry, knights who saw this as a glorious new theater for their martial prowess. This army represented the last great feudal host of the Middle Ages, a glittering assembly of Europe's finest, convinced that their courage and noble birth would guarantee victory. But this confidence quickly curdled into arrogance. As they marched deep into Ottoman territory, they ignored the seasoned advice of their Hungarian allies who understood the tactics of their enemy. The French knights, in particular, charged recklessly ahead, dismissing any notion of a coordinated plan. So eager were they to claim personal glory against what they considered a disorganized foe. They believed their charge alone would shatter any army. This was their fatal mistake. The Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid I, was a master strategist. He did not meet the Crusader charge head-on. Instead, he lured them into a carefully prepared killing ground near the fortress of Nicopolis. The overconfident Crusaders smashed into the Ottoman front lines, only to find themselves exhausted and surrounded by fresh reserve troops and the Sultan's elite cavalry. The battle was not a fight, it was a systematic annihilation. The cream of European knighthood was cut down or captured, with thousands sold into slavery. The defeat was so catastrophic it echoed through every court in Christendom. Nicopolis was more than a lost battle, it was the failure of an entire model of warfare. The old crusading ideal, built around the charge of the armored knight, was proven utterly obsolete against the disciplined, combined arms tactics of the Ottoman military machine. The Crusades' utter collapse left the Balkans defenseless, swinging open the door for further Ottoman conquests that would eventually reach the walls of Vienna. This final, massive effort did not just fail to stop the Ottoman advance, it actively accelerated it, reshaping the political and religious map of Eastern Europe for centuries to come. If the old ways of holy war were now bankrupt, what new strategies would Europe have to devise to survive this relentless new empire? The dream of a united Christendom striking back died on a bloody Bulgarian field. Decades after the disaster at Nicopolis, one last great effort was mounted to turn the tide. The Ottoman advance had continued relentlessly, and the great city of Constantinople, the last remnant of the Roman Empire, was now isolated and gasping for breath. In 1444, a powerful new coalition formed, uniting the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland under their young and charismatic king, Ladislaw III. This was the Varna Crusade, a final, desperate gamble to save Constantinople by shattering the Ottoman army in the field. They were joined by Venetian ships and forces from Wallachia, creating what seemed like a formidable alliance. The Crusader army marched deep into Ottoman territory, fueled by a potent mix of religious fervor and the urgent need to break the siege mentality that had gripped Eastern Europe. Their initial progress was promising, but they were marching toward a foe who had spent a lifetime mastering the art of war. Sultan Murad II, a seasoned and patient commander, met them near the Black Sea city of Varna. The Crusaders, though outnumbered, held a strong defensive position, but then, in a moment of tragic kingly ambition, the entire campaign unraveled. Against the advice of his seasoned commanders, the young King Ladislaw gave in to the chivalric impulse for personal glory. He saw what he believed was a chance to decapitate the enemy army in one bold stroke, and he ordered a direct, headlong cavalry charge aimed straight at the Sultan's own position. It was a breathtakingly audacious move, a knight's gamble for the highest of stakes. The Polish and Hungarian knights smashed into the Ottoman lines, their lances aimed at the heart of their enemy. For a moment, it seemed the gamble might work, but the Ottoman lines, hardened by decades of warfare, did not break. They bent, and then they closed around the king and his bodyguard. In the ensuing melee, the Crusader army watched in horror as their king was cut down and killed, his head mounted on a pole for all to see. With their leader dead, the Crusader alliance shattered instantly. The Battle of Varna was not just a defeat, it was a massacre that erased an army and extinguished a kingdom's hope. This loss had a terrible final consequence. With the last major crusading force annihilated, there was no one left to come to the aid of Constantinople. The city that had been the ultimate prize of the Fourth Crusade and the ancient shield of Christendom was now completely alone. Just 9 years later, in 1453, the Ottomans would finally breach its legendary walls. The Varna Crusade was the true, final breath of the medieval crusading era. It proved beyond any doubt that the old military models of Western Europe were powerless to stop the new empires rising in the East. The age of the Crusade was over, but its long, tangled legacy was only just beginning to shape the modern world. An old man's dying wish could not resurrect a ghost. In 1464, 2 decades after the catastrophe at Varna, and more than a century after the fall of Acre, the crusading dream flickered one last time in the mind of a scholar pope. Pius II was a Renaissance humanist, a man of letters who had once written erotic poetry, yet he became the final pontiff to personally vow to lead a crusade himself. He envisioned a grand expedition to push back the Ottoman tide, a final, glorious reassertion of papal leadership and Christian unity. He called the princes of Europe to join him at the port of Ancona, from where they would sail across the Adriatic to reclaim the holy cause. But the response was a profound and telling silence. The world had moved on. Kings were now focused on building their own national states, their armies and treasuries dedicated to local squabbles, not to a pope's quixotic call for a holy war that had proven so disastrously obsolete. The great Crusader armies of France and Germany, the fleets of Venice and Genoa, they simply did not come. So Pope Pius waited in Ancona, a sick and heartbroken old man watching the empty harbor. He died there not on a battlefield or a ship, but in a quiet port, his grand army consisting of little more than his own disappointed hopes. His death was more than a personal tragedy. It was the final, quiet expiration of the medieval crusading ideal. The authority of the papacy to summon all of Christendom to a sacred war, a power that had once moved continents, died with him on that Italian shore. This non-event, this crusade that never was, is one of the most poignant conclusions imaginable. It demonstrated with heartbreaking clarity that the ideal had become utterly hollow. a political gesture completely detached from the military, economic, and religious realities of a new age. The era of forging empires under the banner of the cross was not just over, it was forgotten, its energy spent, its purpose lost to history. What legacy could such a fractured and failed project possibly leave behind for the world we live in today? Even after the final mainland stronghold crumbled, the Crusader dream refused to die. It simply retreated to the sea, finding sanctuary on two island fortresses that would defy the passage of time. The Kingdom of Cyprus, established by Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade, evolved into a wealthy and resilient state that endured for nearly 300 years after the fall of Acre. Far from being a mere relic, it transformed into a vibrant crossroads of trade and culture, its survival a testament to the power of geography and adaptation. Meanwhile, the Knights Hospitaller, having lost their last foothold in the Holy Land, sailed to the rocky island of Rhodes and forged something entirely new. They built a naval empire, a sovereign state ruled entirely by a military order. From their harbors, the knights launched their powerful galleys not to reclaim Jerusalem, but to patrol the sea lanes, becoming the guardians of Christian shipping against Turkish pirates and the growing Ottoman fleet. They created a state whose purpose was perpetual defensive war, a floating fortress that held the line for more than 2 centuries. These island realms were the final, stubborn incarnation of the Crusader ideal. They proved that the political entities born from holy war could evolve beyond their original purpose, transforming from conquerors of land into masters of the sea. Their prolonged existence raises a profound question. If the Crusader spirit could persist for so long in these isolated bastions, where else did its echoes linger, quietly shaping the world that emerged from the ashes of its grandest ambitions? These 26 expeditions reveal a world where borders were not lines on a map, but living, breathing edges of power, constantly expanding and contracting with the tide of war. The Crusades did not establish permanent Christian empires in the heart of the Levant, but for 2 full centuries they created a stunningly complex political patchwork. Alongside the Kingdom of Jerusalem, independent counties and principalities like Tripoli and Antioch each governed their own stretch of coast and hinterland, a fragile necklace of feudal states strung along the Mediterranean shore. This very fragmentation, however, forced a powerful reaction. The scattered nature of Crusader power ultimately spurred the consolidation of their Muslim rivals. Leaders like Saladin and later the Mamluk sultans unified vast territories under a single banner, forging the strong, centralized states necessary to resist and eventually expel the foreign invasions. The borders that were redrawn were not merely territorial. They were cultural and religious frontiers, places where languages, faiths, and worldviews met, clashed, and sometimes blended. These encounters created deep fault lines of identity and memory, divisions between East and West, Christianity and Islam, that have echoed through the centuries and continue to shape our modern world. The true legacy of these forgotten empires is not just in the castles that still stand in silence, but in the enduring patterns of conflict and exchange they etched into the landscape of history